Thanks for listening to Maxie's Musical Podcast. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like it, share it, write a big fat review. You can also follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook for regular updates about upcoming guests. Today, we're brought to you by Metro Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram of Chicopee. Be sure to stop by their state-of-the-art dealership next to BJ's in Big Y on Memorial Drive, or stop by MetroJeep.com and make it Metro. And then drive home in your new Metro Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram today.
It's Maxie's Musical Podcast.
Hey, here's a fact. Writing a book, any book, is really hard. Writing 9 of them is even harder. But then writing about yourself in the form of a memoir, while you may have been present at the time and deeply involved throughout much of the story itself, it's a completely different challenge and a totally different animal. One, if you've written a book about yourself, then there's a pretty good chance that the story isn't completely finished. And two, as the author, you have to decide what goes in and what stays out. And that's hard to do. That's one of the many reasons that I haven't written a book. That and the fact that no one really cares to read something like that. In 2023, I interviewed author, historian, and musician John Robb. At the time, he had just finished what is perhaps the most complete and thorough book ever written on the topic of goth rock. The name of that book was called Art of Darkness, The History of Goth. It was a hell of a book and a hell of an interview. But John Robb has also written about the history of punk, the music of the 90s, Britpop, and the entire Manchester scene. He's even written about a number of bands such as the Stone Roses, Oasis, the Charlatans, and many others. John Robb has also written for do-it-yourself fanzines that would be distributed throughout the UK. He would also go on to become a freelance contributor to such respected music publications like The Melody Maker and Sounds. He's also written for the Sunday Times, The Observer, The Guardian, and The Independent, and countless websites, including Louder Than War, a website which he founded. He's the guy that termed the phrase Britpop. He was also the first UK journalist to interview Nirvana. He has contributed to hundreds of TV shows, documentaries, and films talking about music and culture and everything in between. On top of that, his band, The Membranes, have released more than a dozen albums since 1983. In other words, John Robb has not only been one of the most recognizable faces in British music journalism over the last 40 years, he's been everywhere else as well. His latest book is a memoir of his long and fascinating career as a journalist, commentator, and musician. The name of the book is ironically entitled Punk Rock Ruined My Life and Other Stories. To talk about how is my guest today, John Robb, on Maxie's Musical Podcast. The last time you and I spoke was 2023, and you had just released Art of Darkness, The History of Goth, and which is a massive look at, I think, what is a very misunderstood genre of music. And you've been a prolific writer for years. But, here you are 3 years later releasing Punk Rock Ruined My Life, a memoir, which I have to believe is like a very different animal, writing a memoir as opposed to, writing about a genre or an artist or something. How do you approach writing your own story as opposed to the story of somebody else?
I guess you sort of, I don't know how you're meant to do it properly. I've no idea. I've never been to a college to learn how to do it. But the way I think about it, it's like a third person thing. So you're kind of writing about yourself, who's somebody else. So in a weird way, it's sort of parallel to the goth books. There's a lot of stuff I wrote about in the goth book, but it's just where I was when all those other things are happening. So sometimes I'm crossing over to that place. Sometimes you cross it over to another place. It was over the same time period.
Yeah.
And what I thought about the book was, hopefully one of its strengths, whatever, is that people have no idea who I am. It doesn't matter. It's a story of a generation. It's people who are my age who, were into music before punk, and then punk came along and made them make music, even though they probably didn't even have any talents, but made them go do it anyway. And then all the little adventures we went on since then. Not just me. I think when people read the book, though, hopefully they'll go, oh, yeah, fuck, I did that, or I didn't do that, or I could have done that. So I thought it was a memoir of a generation, and I'm the narrator. That's kind of how I saw it.
Well, it's interesting because you've written so much about punk and about that entire generation of music that you are a through line in a lot of ways. I mean, you were involved in so much of it that to ignore your participation in it is almost kind of strange that you would have not written your story earlier.
Yes, it's kind of like if somebody who's that mad and they read all the books and can remember them all, it's like the other half of the conversation. So, when I'm writing about goth, so I'm writing about a gig somewhere, I can't write about myself that much in a book about goth. I have to be I'm an observer really, but a lot of that stuff is first-hand experience in that goth book. So those clubs existed, those gigs existed. I was at them. So this is the other way around. This is my part of the story. It's like the last book I did. The book I did in between was a book about Oasis.
Right.
And I knew them really well because they were in the next door rehearsal room. I mean, everyone managed to know everyone else. And so I kept myself out of that book as much as I possibly could. But a lot of those conversations that are going on in that book are real life conversations, real life things, real life bumping into people in the streets. This is just my version of it.
Well, the good news is, when you wrote about goth, I mean, yeah, you were involved in a lot of it, but thank goodness you're not one of those guys that started off in the 18th century, which I think is where you started the story off. You look terrific for a guy who's that old. So,
Yeah, I'm a vampire. That's why.
That's right. There's something kind of ironic about the title of the book, "Punk Ruined My Life." There's a part of the book where you mentioned being a little uncomfortable with the idea of writing about yourself as the subject of the book. But at the same time is also part of the book where you talk about having a photographic memory. I can't think of two things that almost don't work together. A sense of privacy and a photographic memory at the same time.
Well, the memory you just memorize everything's going on around you. So it's not necessarily you're there, you're the observer, aren't you? But it's not necessarily about you too much. I mean, I guess it's an English thing, isn't it? We're not the big I ams here, not like your presidents. We don't. That's why he grates on us so much. Apart from all these fucking terrible policies and all these ways wrecking the planet, but also we just don't like people like that. People walk a room and go, "Look at me." There's no reason why anybody want to look at them. We don't mind looking at people who are cool and doing good stuff. But they have to earn it.
Yeah.
That's our vibe here. That's just where we are. I'm not saying it's a good thing, it's just where we are. So write your own memoirs is a really un-English thing to do. You think, I can't write about myself. That's embarrassing. Then you think, well, I'll just tell the story of all things that are going around me. Then I intersect here and there. I don't think, unless I don't know, unless you're fucking David Beckham or some superstar, no one really cares about your private life.
Right.
People know you as a person, and the best, they know you've got something to do with music. So, like I say, now I'm not the narrator of a memoir of a generation. That's why. So it's not the only version of that generation's events, but it's a lot of the signposts that people my age will go through. From what we did with punk, post-punk, how we operated then, all the bands that came afterwards, what we did, our bands, our fanzines. And all about, and then, write about Nirvana first. I mean, it's a good story, isn't it? And how is the quest, to find what punk rock was through all these different eras, because it changed and morphed what people thought punk was. And what we did as well, because you grow and you change as well. So your idea when you're 15 when punk starts is quite different than it is now. But oddly, quite similar, because you still maintain the idealism and you still believe that maybe you can change the world, They need it now, isn't it? More than ever.
It's interesting how you end the book and you recite the title of the book. Punk rock ruined my life, but it also saved your life. And we'll get to some of the other parts of that story a little bit. But I mean, there's something really interesting about pointing that out. That punk rock in your life has kind of had like a duplicity in itself. On one hand, it may have changed your life in any number of directions, but you've also squeezed out an amazing career as a result of it. And the irony of it is certainly not lost on me, but I think it's a really important point about, what this has all meant to you over the course of your lifetime.
Also, it's a very typically punk title, and I mean, punk was never self-congratulatory, and punk was also chucking out curveballs, wasn't it? I mean, it was never about saying how wonderful everything is, was it? So it makes me laugh that some people don't. So people say you didn't ruin your life at all. Why is it called that? I go, no, don't you get it? You couldn't get a more punk rock title, can you? It's in that tradition of Never Mind the Bollocks or all those great disdainful titles, which was so again very British punk rock. So it can do, yeah, I suppose like on paper, I mean, I could have probably got a proper job and, I lived out in the suburbs, a nice house or whatever, if I'd stuck in at school. But I didn't want to, punk rock gave me that little. So on one level, it ruined my life from a conventional life, but it gave me the life I wanted, which is completely unconventional, totally unpredictable, and changes every hour. So every hour you do one thing, there's suddenly going to do something else. And I like that. I like that unpredictability, and everything's fresh and new. And that's the other thing in it, like when you do memoirs, because you have to go back in the past. And one of the things about punk, the way we saw it, was it's always about going forwards. But then I suppose it's an age thing, and you suddenly get to an age where you just keep doing the past. And but I do like history, so I'm fascinated with history. I'm not interested in history of kings and queens. I'm interested in the history of normal people. So I find, the history of somebody owning grocers in a small town in England in the 1930s, and to me, would be far more interesting than what the king and queen were up to. That's sort of people's history. I think, in a sense, this is a people's history, because punk was, at the end of the day, it was a people's movement. It's one of those rare moments in pop culture where the fabric's torn and everyone else gets through. And most of the time, you have no chance of getting in there. And that space in punk when you could DIY it and bluff it, make it up as you went along, was brilliant. It's like we probably did have no musical talent, but we were entertaining in our lunatic way. I'm talking about myself here, my bands. We were never going to make it in a band. But we had a little space where we could be a cult band. Because there was another bunch of people who got that energy and understood what we represented. Similar to a lot of other bands at the time. It wasn't about superstars. It was about just these kind of weird cult bands that exist in this kind of post-punk space, because we got through. We'd gone through that cracking time and come out the other side. And I think that was important as well. I think that's as much about part of the punk experience as anything. And it does reflect around the world, because I know a lot of people in America, who've had a similar kind of existences that was created by punk. It's a delayed response, because it was, people like Ian MacKaye or Rollins. I know those guys, and they're they had a very British experience of punk rock. It's quite weird. You speak to Ian MacKaye, he loves all those original British records, really obscure ones that people in Britain did, like Empire, the other half Generation X. There were about 200 people even bought that record, and he was one of them. So, oddly, I've met people in America who have a more British experience of punk rock than people in Britain have.
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, how that DIY experience, like you said, is very similar as the U.S. had, and very similar to what was going on in Great Britain. There's a couple of big watershed moments in punk that I think everyone can point to. The Sex Pistols and the Bill Grundy incident, the New Roads from the Damned. But I think the thing that we often overlook in all of this is the importance of the Buzzcocks and Spiral Scratch from 1977. Like, of all the things that happened, this seemed to unlock the floodgates for everyone to say, I not only can start a band, I can do all of it myself. To me, that was such an important message for kids to realize, at a time when there's nothing for kids to do except get in trouble or get into drugs or whatever. Here you have a template built by those guys. And I mean, to me, that's one of the most amazing, overlooked part of the entire story.
Yeah, but it's a 7-inch manifesto, isn't it? I mean, I remember somebody brought to school and going, you never seen a record that looked like it, because they're all, the ones we had before were in really well-designed colour sleeves. And this is early 77, so it's only about the third punk single, so it's really super early. And you think, that looks homemade. And it took about a year and a half to work out how you make a homemade record. Don't forget, I'm not in Manchester or London. I'm in Blackpool, 50 miles away from Manchester. So we're isolated. We're on the outside, and we're trying to work out how to do this thing from beyond. There's no one to ask. You can't Google it. You just sort of guessworking the whole thing. But saying that, without the Pistols, nothing would have happened. The Pistols were the number one. And I see internet forums now, and you see people, they're just a boy band. They weren't really. It's all Mark McLaren. Well, yeah, Mark McLaren was really important in the Pistols. And Vivian was important. The Pistols. Now I've realised years later that all the greatest bands are actually 10-piece bands. It's not just the band. He's a visionary manager. He's somebody who does great artwork. It could be their mates, or a producer like Joy Division, Martin Hannett. Fucking what an amazing producer. He was soundtracking the future. We've only just caught up to him now, 40 years later. We didn't have any of those things. We were fumbling in the dark, it's years later you realise you need the whole thing to make it work. But the Pistols did have the whole thing, and it was and with a rotten. I know he's different now than he was then, but then he was amazing. Every interview was killer. He looked amazing. He was like we'd had Bowie, and Bowie was mind blowing. And that little 5 years period of time, he was another version of Bowie. He wasn't trying to do a David Bowie, but he occupied the same space in the culture. This game-changing guy just kept moving. He's always 2 steps ahead of you, and he'd gone somewhere else. We love the Pistols, and suddenly he's doing Pill, and it's like, wow, what's this? And then Mel Box is like, wow, this is insane. It feels punk rock, but it doesn't sound anything like punk rock. And it's one of my favourite all-time records. I loved it when it came out. And you got to remember, we're all about 18 or 19. That's a massive jump to make me a teenager, isn't it? From like the Pistols, they're rock and roll, but they're weird rock and roll. They're not a conventional rock and roll band. To go from there to one of the most avant-garde records that's ever been released, really. Yeah.
I remember when 1977, so I would have been a fairly young kid. I was probably like 10 or 11 years old. But I remember news stories coming out of the UK about this horrifying, awful band called the Sex Pistols, and people were shocked. They were out of their freaking minds about it. But what I thought was so interesting is the Sex Pistols go through this period where they're public enemy number one, and then 40 years later, John Lydon is a national treasure. So, doing butter commercials and just being on game shows, and it's like it's to me it's the most incredible arc of one man's career, maybe in the entire history of popular music.
It is weird. I don't begrudge him, but it is weird now, because now when I think of the Pistols, I start to think, were they just showbiz? But of course they were showbiz, weren't they? And I come from a holiday town, so I don't really have that big a problem with it. I mean, Blackpool, where I come from, is like Las Vegas, but like a rainy version. So it's like showbiz, music hall. And the Pistols are that, and they're very British, aren't they? They're very British, NDP a British music hall in a way, but like like the bad guys, oh no, they didn't. They're still one of the greatest bands of all time.
Without question.
This is the thing, that when people talk about the Pistols, they never talk about the music. But I think the clothes, they looked amazing. This is the difference between the American and the British punk as well. It's very important to make the distinction. It was all about, the clothes are important over here. People go, oh, the Pistols are just clothes horses. Yeah, that's what British punk was about. The clothes and the music was so entwined. Whereas in America, not so much. I mean, the Ramones did look great, but they looked like a 1950s street gang. And it was kind of retro, but celebration retro. And I get that, it's great. But the Pistols, when you saw picture, you don't get this now because you can't understand it. But if you saw a picture in 1976, when you saw a picture of Johnny Rotten in a newspaper, it was like, fuck, what the fuck is that? Like an alien. You've never seen anybody with their hair or their eyes, the starry eyes, and the attitude and the clothes and the safety pins. It was fucking amazing. It was a template for the future. Now you look at it, it's just another phase in pop cultural history. It's another museum exhibit. But at the time, it was game changing. It was mesmerizing.
You've written a lot about the fashion of the music and the music itself, and how they are so intricately intertwined. You certainly did it in the goth book, and again in this book as well, where it is very hard to distinguish both of them running at the same time. I mean, fashion is an intricate part of what made that so compelling. You're right. You don't really see that in the same way today, since there are 12-year-old kids wearing Joy Division shirts in the United States. They have no idea what Joy Division is. They just like the shirt. But back then, the Sex Pistols were kind of built on this Richard Hell type of template for fashion, and it really is a very important part of the whole thing.
And I mean, Richard Hell's kind of in there, but it's British glam rock, really, that the Pistols. At the time, glam rock seemed, when punk came out, glam rock seemed like it's from the Victorian era. It seemed like 100 years before. But then now, when I look back at years later, punk is a continuation, in a sense, of glam. So it's Bowie, isn't it? Richard Hell, I love Richard Hell. The Void George, an amazing band, and he looked really cool, But it was Bowie. They're all Bowie. We were all Bowie kids. I mean, we didn't dress up like Bowie. You could dress up like Bowie in Blackpool. You couldn't get stuff like you couldn't even. Well, Bowie could even work out to spike his hair. I interviewed Susie Ronson last year, and she did the hair, didn't she? The Ziggy hair, and they didn't have any hair. She's a hairdresser. They didn't have the right products to make his hair stand on end. So that picture was like a very quick snap before his hair fell over. So what chance would we have in getting the hair products to look like that?
Right.
So Bowie was like completely alien and completely out there and completely mind blowing. He's a new kind of rock and roll style. It was plastic but also emotional. It's detached and alien like, but also songs that moved you, weren't they? It's quite an interesting dichotomy, and he looked incredible. And punk was basically the children of Ziggy played out in London, then across all these weird little towns, wherever they're trying to do their version of it. You can see when you know that you can see it. Virtually over 80% of punk is coming out of Bowie, and it's so I'm not doing Richard Hell down here. Just in Britain, Bowie was such a thing, glam rock Bowie, Ziggy Stardust was massive here,
Yeah.
and to a certain extent Mark Bolan as well because of his records, and we all love Mark Bolan as well. So it's American influence, but it's not. It wasn't like Richard Hell. People saw a picture of them punk started. It was part of a lot of influences that are coming in. And for the British scene was very dressed up. It was about being dressed up. But all the bands had a different look, didn't they? So, I mean, Buzzcocks were about as dressed up as you could get in Manchester in 1976, which is homemade shirts. They painted their own Mondrian shirts, didn't they? They couldn't, to get drain pipe trousers in north of England was impossible. There were none, 1976. It's all right in London. You could go to sex shop, not afford to buy anything, but look at the clothes. But we didn't have anything like that in the north. It's second-hand clothes for us, and trying to stitch trousers in to make them like more drain pipey. I didn't realise. I mean, the Clash always looked amazing, but I didn't realise they had it on the road. Taylor, I know her, Alex Michon, she's called, and she would make their clothes. She'd make trousers for them on the road, which is ace. I have no problem with that. But we thought they went to Oxfam. We thought their Oxfam's much better than ours. Oxfam's, for the American listeners, it's a British second-hand clothes shop, thrift store. So you go in, you could get, if you were lucky, you could get a 50s D-mob suit. So when people came out of the army, they were given a suit and to go to work in. And it's a very cool 50s cut, like thin lapels and that. Well, by the 70s, those guys are starting to die, they get to 50, 60, 70. So their clothes end up in second-hand shops. So you could occasionally get a D-mob suit, which would be the number one second-hand store item. Or number two would be wedding suits, and you take the trousers in. I mean, it's crap, isn't it? We just couldn't get the stuff. We had to pierce our own ears. We couldn't, with a cork and a compass, because they wouldn't pierce a boy's ears when I was growing up in Blackpool. It's only for girls. So you went to jewellers and they just wouldn't do it, So we made our hair standing there with soap. It was so amateurish. It was so naive, but so beautiful, because you're making it up as you go along. When we did gigs, the machine heads and the guitar were in a row. We thought that's what they were. We didn't know anything about tuning up. We didn't know what chords were. They had no idea what the names of the strings were. But we still played the gig. We still played the first 10 gigs were like that, completely out of tune, horrible racket, but pure. It's pure because it was all we had and all we knew what to do. Whereas now, you just Google all the chord shapes and work them out, wouldn't you? And go, all right, that's cool. Is that how you do it? But we thought the other bands were on a level playing field. We thought the Pistols and the Clash and all the other bands they're just like us, just kids who just bought guitars 2 months before. We didn't know they'd all worked out how to play. And they are some of the greatest bands of all time that came out of England. They basically weren't us. We were fumbling amateurs, and they were brilliantly professional, great bands. I listen now and think there's a level of sophistication in their music that we had no chance of getting to.
It's funny. I just did an interview about a couple of weeks ago with Michael Bradley from the Undertones. And
great guy.
Great,
Yeah.
Wonderful guy. And his book is terrific too. And there's a part in his book that was almost identical to your story too. And that, you both formed a band early on without any preconceived notion about what that was going to mean or how to do it. And it just seemed like that was the case for a lot of young kids at the time. They were a band before they even knew how to play music. And it sounded like that's kind of the arc that the Membranes had. It's like you started off not knowing what the hell you were doing, but then it came to you, and all of a sudden, things start turning around. And it was funny to read your version of the story, because there were a lot of parallels between the two of you.
The only difference is that they did it properly. They learned cover versions, and they learned how to write songs. Probably they were quite talented as well. Whereas we were totally in love with music. I was, still am, but I was really obsessed, 24/7 music head. So that was my thing. But they had great songwriters, didn't they? And they learned about the great songs. They learned how to construct great songs. But I suppose what we did, I suppose this was our little USP, is we took our willful amateurism thing and we turned it into an art form. So we honed it down to a perfection. So by 5 years later, we were making songs up with no idea that they were meant to be tune or scales, but somehow they make sense. But it's our sense. It was unique. It didn't sound like anybody else, which I suppose any artist is always trying to be unique, but I would never advise anybody to do it, because you just get right up a cul-de-sac. Because most people have no idea what you're trying to do, because it is so unique. Whereas the Undertones wrote brilliant pop songs. Again, like the Buzzcocks, one of the greatest pop bands ever. Really, really fantastic songs. You listen to those albums, every song was great, innit?
Yeah.
But they were ahead of the game. They started before punk, didn't they?
Right.
They're about a year up. They're probably a year or two older than me, I think. And they've been in the band for 2 years, and punk came along, and they'd obviously learned to play guitars, haven't they? Whereas we didn't know anything about the theory of guitar. They may even got guitar lessons, but they were doing it properly, and they made something brilliant out of it. And at the time, if somebody said, you have to go do this properly, we'd probably told them to fuck off. We're going to do it our way. This is how we're going to do it. This is what punk's about.
Right.
You just willfully go off. Everyone's going this way. We're going to go that way.
Well, you certainly did that. I mean, in the book, you talk about the Membranes playing coming in dead last in a local talent show. And then, just a few years later, I mean, you guys have improved to a degree where now you're releasing music. And then suddenly John Peel gets a hold of a single and starts to play you guys on the show. I mean, that's for any band, that appearance on a John Peel show had to be mind blowing for you.
Yeah, well, it's and the music press as well. So
Yeah.
after about 3 years in isolation, people started picking up on us, and I suppose, yeah, I mean, we did get pretty good at what we were doing, I suppose, and then so in a way, I think I think now post punk, there's a lot of small town people like I was. I mean, that's another thing. Crux of this book is most of the punk memoirs are written from the perspective of people in big cities or whatever. Not all of them, but most of them. And I was writing from the experience of the foot soldier, the people on the outside, the people from the small towns getting beaten up all the time, being punk and trying to make the music with no idea what they were doing. And there's a lot of us doing that. I mean, some people, suppose punk really was that generation coming to flower, wasn't it? So, Bauhaus soon Bela Lugosi's Dead, which is an amazing record, isn't it? Another great song written in isolation.
Yep.
It doesn't really follow any conventional musical rules, does it? But they managed to make something really commercial out of it. Now, music commercial is a good word here, because I think I'm not really into the underground. I think it's annoying. All the best stuff is shoved into the underground. Why can't we all get in the mainstream? Make the mainstream poison the mainstream. That's what people forget that now. Punk. They think it's. Again, you look all these discussions online, and people go, the Pistols are sellouts because he had a number 1 album. I go, no, that was the revolution. They got all those ideas into the mainstream. It changed our lives, being willfully in the underground. That's being snobby, isn't it? It's like saying, no, you have to understand this music. Where it's music that's a bit above you. I hate that attitude. I think you should be snobby about your own things. You want to push it as far as you can. But you should never, ever restrict who can listen to it because you think you're better than them. I'm not into that at all. So I think post-punk was that coming through there's all loads of these mad little quirky bands in all these really unlikely places up and down the country, and then we start playing these places, and we didn't have an agent. We didn't even know what a gig agent was. We just wrote to the fanzines because we did a fanzines. And all the fanzine editors in all these towns, we just say to them, put us on. And, they go, we don't have to put a gig on. I said, we'll just go and get a room in a pub and go and get a vocal PA. We'll come and play. And that's how we toured. We basically created our own mad little ecosystem, our own world, beyond the music business.
Well, I want to ask you about that because you've mentioned the British music press a couple of times, and obviously at the time there's an established press operation, but all these fanzines and self publishing come out. It really is very much like the do it yourself aesthetic of punk, but it becomes extraordinarily important to not only the history of it, but it comes incredibly important to each individual band that says, "Hey, you know what? I can't get any press on my own from like the Melody Maker, but all I got to do is find a mimeograph machine, and all of a sudden I can promote the hell out of myself and my friends." To me, it's a really important part of punk and about it, and certainly we had that in the States too.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, so I mean, it's a really important part of it.
It's a parallel revolution, isn't it? It was the DIY thing was not just people forming their own bands, it was people making their own fanzines, and I mean, I had no idea you could put your own fanzine. The weirdly though, was because my mate's dad, my mate who was actually in the membrane, was Mark, who was a guitar player, his dad was a printer. And I said I wouldn't mind. I'm sure we're talking, we'll have a cup of tea with Mark around his house, and his dad overheard us talk about writing stuff. He said, we could just photocopy it. And we go, what's that? And he said, hey, photocopy it. And I'll make 50. So that's how we did it. I had a typewriter, I never used it. Typed out some stuff, we stuck it down with little sticky Pritt stick things. And he took it off and made 50 copies. And he also did a thing about the school, like a piss take thing in the school. I'm on, like slagging the school off. And I got thrown out of school for it because they thought there was an anarchist cell running around the school. But I thought we were naive. Fucking hell, I'm naive than the teachers.
Yeah.
To this day, one of my favourite punk words is V-Rock. So even though it's a really old word that goes back to 1920,
Right.
but the actual word looks really punk rock. And the idea that you could create your own media, which now, I mean, people do it all day long on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Everybody creates their own media. But then the idea of just setting yourself up as a reviewer was revolutionary, isn't it? Think
Yeah.
about it. Anybody could write anything, anybody could play anything. That's what punk said. As long as you didn't expect it was going to be a career, it's not like you weren't doing it as a career, because now there's 100,000 million bands, everybody's in a band, and everybody expects it's going to be a career. They go, can't tour, I can't afford to stay in a hotel. You go, hotel? There's only 4 people at your gig. I mean, who's paying for all this stuff, So you have to have a level of realism to it. And I'm saying that as somebody who spent 10 years in a band, either coming back after gigs or sleeping on promoters' floors. That's what we always do. I mean, in America, people did it as well, didn't they? The Minutemen wrote a book about it, didn't they? Touring econo, as in touring economy level. But people go, oh, it's amazing they've written a book about this thing. I thought that was just a normal way of picking a band. We've done it all over Europe, I mean, we go play the old Yugoslavia and stay on somebody's floor, I don't know how we did it. It must have been absolutely knackered, but it's the only way you could get your music out there. And there was no massive record label paying money for you. It was underground, DIY. Now I prefer the term DIT, do it together. I think it's, you can do it on your own. If you have to do your own, do your own. But if you can do it with other people and you pool all your skills, you can create a space for everybody to be created in. And I think that's what's important, isn't it? So, saying that, I mean, I'm not one of those people who's anti-bands signed to major labels. I don't think being on a medium-sized indie label has got any high moral value than being on a big major. I think sometimes you have to be realistic. How are you going to survive? Some people in bands aren't good at hustling gigs. They don't like doing it, or they're trying to get themselves listened to. It's hard. A lot of people in bands are very introverted people, and see. I stand in the call box, phoning people up for hours on end in the pissing rain, trying to get somebody to listen to my music. And I'm not saying that was like the greatest hours of my life, but somebody had to do it because you had to get your stuff out there, didn't you? The rest of the band couldn't do it. They're just too nervous to ring people up. So I ended up having to do it all.
Yeah. Well, you spent a number of years in the membranes, and you do talk about what happened to the band, financially, and how there was a series of bad breaks along the way, like you hear so many times. A song like Spike Milligan's Tape Recorder should be a song that everyone in the world should have heard, but maybe not, simply because the business of music may have been working against you, or there may have been, other things that might not have been helpful to you. But that's a pretty interesting way you kind of phased out of the membranes a little bit.
Yeah, well, when we're on small labels, and even when we're on, that could have come out in Creation, that record, but Creation was a nothing label then, so Alan McGee, just this mad bloke who gave you gigs in London and paid you properly. But it's only a small scene, there'd be 100 people, that'd be the whole alternative in London. And then he's going to start a label. I thought, he couldn't afford to put us in the studio, he had no money then. He's mad now, you think how loaded he is. So we're on like really obscure labels. I didn't really know what they were doing, so but now, now I see how it works. And we were doing it wrong. Of course we were. We had no idea what to do. My contemporaries are people like Nick Cave. But Nick Cave was living in London and he was working with bigger labels. He went to London to make sure his career was in the right place. They were a fucked up band. It was an amazing band, The Birthday Party, but they're also in a much more fortuitous position than we were. They're on a better label. They made sure they're on a better label, and they have managers and agents and all this kind of thing that we didn't have. We were totally on the outside. So in a way, I'm the only one of my generation of bands that didn't actually make it.
But you did pretty good outside of it, though.
No, I'm not complaining. I think it's funny. We toured the world and we did have a cult following. Even the last album, 2 albums we did, they're actually our best-selling records. We sold, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 of each one, which I know is not going to trouble Michael Jackson, is it? But it's quite a lot for a cult band these days.
Yeah.
And they're not that hard to listen to, but they don't fit in any scene. There's no compromise going on. The last one was like this kind of sort of dark post-punk record with choirs on it. I think, well, that's a genre of one, isn't it? It wasn't meant to be like that. You think if only we could just get that so people could listen to it, but I don't know. We can write tunes. They always have good melodies, but then we get, what's what we do? We'd have a song with a really good melody in it, then we drown the melody out as much as we could, which is so willfully destructive. But that was a punk thing, wasn't it? It was all about, those painters who paint great works of art that set fire to them on a bonfire so no one sees them. Right. I think that was very, very us.
There's a part in the book that I really enjoyed, and it was the whole section where you're talking about you're working with the late Steve Albini. And
he was a very in one way he was very similar, and a lot of other ways he was quite different.
Yeah.
But we definitely tuned into each other.
Yeah. It definitely sounded like there was some chemistry between the two of you, and that he really understood what the band was all about. And one of the things that I know of Steve Albini, especially as a producer, not just necessarily as the guy in Big Black, but he was very interested in staying true to the vision of whatever the band he was working with. Not every producer does that. A Martin Hannett, for example, probably wouldn't give a shit about.
He's the opposite.
Total opposite. But to good effect, though.
Yeah. Steve liked Martin Hannett, though. He wasn't so pure as he didn't like people that did what he did. But he was not a producer. He was a sound recordist. He's the world's best sound recordist, wasn't he? He knew everything about mics and mic placement and stuff like that. But at that time, because we didn't know much about studios, we didn't know what he was an engineer. We didn't know he was a sound recorder. So we just thought he was a producer. So it's always that thing. I'm sure a lot of bands do this and just waiting for him to give you some guidance. Of course, he didn't give a fuck what you're doing. He's just recording what's in front of him. But because we're one of the first bands, in fact, we virtually were the first band we ever did outside Urge Overkill, who's his flatmate when he lived in his house, Nate. And so we went over there and we recorded in the cellar of his house in Evanstown in Chicago. And he just started to work with other bands just after us. So we sort of bumbled on the scene because we liked the sound of those early Big Black records, because he obviously understood noise, but he knew how to make it listenable. It's a really weird balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
The immersive excitement of developing noise, but not in a way that is too much. And he just got that line right in the middle for, wow, he knows how to do. Because we fluked it on Spike Mistake recording to a certain extent to the follow at Death to Trad Rock. But we didn't know how to, when we made our album, we went over the top. It was a fucking mess.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, this guy actually knows how to get the sound we're after. And I asked him, he played Manchester in 1987. That's when I asked him. But 2 years, he said, 2 years before he said, when I met him that night, he'd actually come to England. He's trying to find us. He'd been on holiday. He went to the rough trade shop, and this is so pre-internet. He said, how do I get in touch with the membranes? And they said, he said, have you got a phone number for him? They didn't have a phone number for me, so he couldn't get in touch with me. So he said he was good. He said he would come up to Manchester to come and meet what he thought were fellow travellers. He would have been disappointed because at that time he was obviously he had a very dark sense of humour, didn't he? Like he's a very dark,
Very.
yeah, and then he liked to fuck with your head. So we stayed at his house about a week on that tour, and he found out we were vegetarian, which really did his head in. So he'd be eating like massive steaks and trying to annoy us. But the only English people I think he'd met before that were ones who get upset by that kind of thing. But the north of England, where I'm from, it's a different sense of humour. He's just he don't care about stuff like that. We just thought he was funny. He did tell me he's going to call his next band Rape Band. I was going, that ain't going to work, Steve. I know what you're trying to do here. I know punk's meant to be really offensive, and you are. I get you want to be the most offensive person in punk rock ever, but you're just going to make your life really difficult.
I had a roommate that came to the apartment one day, and he had just bought Big Black's Headache, and he said, "Hey, take a look at this." And and my reaction was, "What the fuck is this?" And it was, the most grisly, disgusting album cover I've ever seen in my life, but yet.
He had the artwork for it.
He had the
at his house,
right?
The original picture. But he hadn't put it out then. It was just the. He said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And then that's a record cover. But the weird thing was, the last time I met him 5 years ago, was it 5? I did an in conversation with him in Holland, and I was always in touch with him. So we did stuff with Gold Blade with Steve. He recorded a song for us. And so I did this in conversation with Holland. So I'm talking to him, and he's really mellowed out. He's completely different. And then halfway through it, he goes, "I really got to apologise how awful I used to be." And he went on this kind of monologue in public about how vile he was and how horrible. He doesn't agree with any positions he used to have, which is an amazing thing to do.
Yeah.
But I said, look, Steve, we got it. Everyone got it. We knew. At the time, I thought he's just put all this on. He's not. You do those columns for forced exposure about how horrible he was, and it's just self-loathing, beating himself up, wasn't it? Just like trying to be as gross as possible to annoy people. I thought he's not like that at all. You can see it in like 2 seconds flat. But the Steve, I liked him then, of course. I liked him, because I knew it was all bluff. I really liked him the last time I met him because he was so warm and nice and engaging. And then I was in touch with my friend in Holland, Poland had him over to do a Portugal. To do an interview on stage, and I didn't make that. But I sent a little film and they showed it on the stage. I was filming my phone saying, what a great guy he was and how talented he was and that. And he sent me a picture of him, Steve watching it, and he said Steve was like getting really misty-eyed, like quite emotional.
Wow.
I thought, that's nice, isn't it? Yeah, it's a shock when he died. It really affected me, that. I mean, a lot of people I know died now, because I'm getting to that age, rock and rollers don't live forever. It was so out of the blue, and he was so vibrant, and he seemed to be in the middle of his career, not the end of it. And it's there's about 10 people who died. I mean, it'd been really massive shocks. You think, fucking hell, it takes ages and ages to get yourself back on track again, doesn't it?
Yeah. Your career as a journalist and a commentator is pretty fascinating. I don't think there's been a British music documentary in the last 15 years that you were not a part of in some way, shape, or form. But one of the things that I've always appreciated about your work, and I think this is the thing that I actually appreciate the most, are the interviews you've done. A lot of them are really, really fascinating. What would you say would be like your most memorable interviews? Like, is there one that you could say, man, that just came out so great and it was so good to meet that person? Is there one that sticks out in your mind?
It's maybe glib answer, but I like them all, really, because I don't think people have to be that good at interviews to be interesting. Do you know what I mean? Like, some people aren't. I like those ones where people aren't that good at talking, and they talk to you anyway. They trust you enough to tell you loads of stuff, you know. And so I like those ones, and they might not even be that eloquent, you know. You know, like, well, if you ask Peter Hook how he writes those amazing bass lines, he just goes, I've no idea. I just hit the bass and it sounds quite catchy. But I think they're things of beauty, aren't they? You know, the way he talks about them, they're just things he just dashed off. But it shows us there's somebody else underneath that person, isn't there? It's like, he's not going to go, this is not the very northern thing. You're not going to go, hey, everybody, I'm a poet. That's not northern. You're not going to go, oh, I write really beautiful bass lines. You're just going to go, I'll just bang them out. Shit, aren't they? That's very northern. But it shows it's like a little porthole into that person's character, isn't it? I find that fascinating, you know. So they don't have to explain it. And I think that's cool. They don't have to explain it. People don't, I think in art, you never have to explain what you do. It just comes out, doesn't it? It may be pretty contrary. It might be the opposite of what you are as a person, but it just comes out and you think, that's good, that. I don't know why it's good, but it's just good. And yet, you know, because a lot of people when they interview people think that person had to explain in detail. You know, when people ask people what their lyrics are about, well, of course, it's okay, it's a fair enough question, but they don't have to answer the question, I don't think, you know, because it's not, you know, when people ask Noel Gallagher what your words about, he just goes, I don't know, just make them up. We'll just fit the tune.
Yeah.
You know, but they are about something. He ain't going to tell you, you know, so not always. Sometimes it's a bit like Get Back by the Beatles when George can't write the lyrics or something. And John Lennon just says, sing Pomegranates, you know, because he gets the tune, doesn't it?
Right.
Sometimes you leave Pomegranate in because it just sounds better. But the next line's got something that's completely soulful in it, you know. Or it's just a sound. I mean, the words might not explain anything, but the sound of them may be quite emotional as well. That's why I love pop music. It's never black and white. It's never explained. It's like shifting sounds, and it can mean different things on different days, can't it? So when you bring that into the interview situation, it's not. I don't think it's like an academic exercise where everything has to be explained to death. You know, people can be vague, and I like that as well. I just want the person, to be themselves. You know, they don't have to be. You don't have to be engaging. They've already done the work. They've already made a great piece of art. You know, they could just be themselves and that. But you know, then you get some people very analytical, very good at explaining about what they do. So the British comedian Stuart Lee, he's not that known in America, but he was fascinating, telling about the history of musical, history of comedy, and how that relates to what he does. And he's a very political comedian, but also very funny and quite left field. So in comedy terms, he's a comic according to the fall. You know, he's quite avant-garde, but he does really well over here, and he's quite curmudgeonly and difficult. Fantastic. Yeah.
I think one of the more interesting explanations of lyrics in music is with Andy Partridge, a guy who lets the music dictate what those lyrics are going to wind up being. I always thought that was like a very interesting way of. I mean, he's got synesthesia, so his brain works in a very different type of way. But to hear it from him, it's like, wow, that's a really interesting way of creating music.
XTC were the greatest bands that came out the whole period, aren't they? You know,
Yeah.
I listen to them most days. I listen to their records, you know, severely underrated. I think they did all right. They sold records. They had hit records in England, a few, and then sort of disappeared into their own kind of thing. But every single album is completely different, and every single album is really good. There's no good, you know, there isn't one duff album in the whole career. They go from psychedelia to post-punk to weird kind of Wurzel music made out in Middle England.
Well, admittedly, that's my favorite band of all time, and I've had I don't know how I was able to manage to do this. I've talked to every member of the band, and I was like, if I quit today, I would be more than happy. So,
I've done 3.
Yeah.
Amazing drummer. He's a great drummer.
Oh,
you know,
Terry's great, and
powerful drummer, but he won't tell you anything about the artfulness of it. He would just say, I like hitting things. But he's a really good. I mean, Andy would have come up with some of the rhythms because Andy Partridge would write songs starting with the drums sometimes, but Terry would take them somewhere else. I mean, got a great drum sound in the 80s. That big, heavy drum sound was them plus Hugh Padgham on it, you know. And I think a lot of bands copied it as well. His lyrics do have meaning. I think he's a brilliant lyric writer, you know, little puns and twists on the words, you know, just clever, but also meaningful as well. He did have a meaning. You know. Now when I look back on him, I think that they're almost the ultimate punk band because people always had them down as being these artsy fartsy, too clever bands, but actually there were four working class lads from Swindon. They were all these other punk bands. Most of them weren't that working class at all. But XTC, who most people think were a bit of a Ponzi art band, or actually were. They grew up
Right.
in a bit of a shitty town, nowhere town in England, and and sang songs that did have a social meaning to them. They actually did more politically, social songs than the Clash did,
Without a
in a
doubt.
sense. And I
I
love the Clash, but Joe, I know Joe was a public school boy. It's fine, you can't help his background, and he's emotional, and he meant it, and they are one of the greatest bands. But why is XTC not embraced in the same way? I suppose it's because they stopped touring. I saw them, so you didn't see them, did you?
Yeah, well,
Most people never saw them.
I never had the chance to see them, but yeah,
No,
I
they
mean,
stopped. They
unbelievable.
stopped too early, didn't they? They
They
did
really
tour
did.
America a couple of times.
They
I saw them play in Manchester, 1979, and we got to the gig early because we thought, "Whoa, these are really big." It was going to be. They played the Apollo. And we went down the front. There's only about 200 people in there. Great gig, though. Wow,
Yeah.
I still remember it really clearly.
amazing.
Yeah.
John, I really enjoyed talking to you again. Again, the book is wonderful. It's a great story and really really well done.
You got a print.
I got the
You
print.
got a print. Wait a minute. I've not seen the print.
Oh, you haven't? I got the book before you do. How the hell did that happen? Yeah, that's an advanced proof copy right there from the publisher. So I was able to. Yeah. So I guess it's all who you know, John. It's all who you know.
The publisher's only round the corner from where I live. They could have told me how to print.
Well, then you get over there today and say, "Hey, I'd like my copy of my book, please."
And I've still not seen it. I mean, I've seen the cover, but I've not seen the rest of it.
Yeah, it's really really good. I really enjoyed the hell out of it. So, but thank you.
Brilliant.
But thank you so much for joining me again. I can't wait to talk to you again sometime.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Appreciate it.
You
All
bet.
right.
The name of John Robb's new book is called Punk Rock Ruined My Life and Other Stories. It's going to be released on May 19th. Be sure to check out John's website, Louder Than War, as well. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you can reach me at bax@rock102.com. I'd love to hear what you think. Thanks to Metro Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram at Chicopee. But most of all, thanks to you for listening to Baxy's Musical Podcast.